Wives, I'm glad you made your husbands come today. They woke you up early last week, made you show up, so turnabout's fair play. Have you ever gotten an advertisement on the internet for a piece of software and you just thought, I gotta have that piece of software? Have you ever had that happen? Yeah, I know. You do it. You get that piece of software. Well, this fella saw a piece of software, Wife 1.0. He's been running Girlfriend 5.0 for a while, and now here's Wife 1.0. It's got some applications to it that he was really interested in. Clean 2.5, Sweep 3.0, Cook 1.5, Do Laundry 4.2, Wash Dishes 5.3, and Organize Home 6.4. And he's thinking, wow, this is a great upgrade. I got to get this. Well, a little while after he gets it and installs it, he writes a letter to technical support. Goes this way: Dear Tech Support, last year I upgraded from Girlfriend 5.0 to Wife 1.0. I soon noticed that the new program began unexpected child processing that took up a lot of space and valuable resources. In addition, Wife 1.0 installed itself into all other programs, and now it monitors all other system activity. I can't keep Wife 1.0 in the background while trying to run my favorite applications like Poker Night 10.3, Football 5.0, Hunting and Fishing 7.5, and Racing 3.6. I'm thinking about reverting to Girlfriend 5.0, but the uninstall doesn't work on Wife 1.0. Please help. Signed, Troubled User. He gets a response: Dear troubled user, this is a very common problem. Many people upgrade from Girlfriend 5.0 to Wife 1.0 thinking that it is just a utilities and entertainment program. That is incorrect. Wife 1.0 is an operating system and is designed to run everything. It is impossible to uninstall or purge the program files from the system once installed. Wife 1.0 is designed not to allow this. Look in your Wife 1.0 manual under Warnings, Alimony/Child Support. I suggest installing the background application, Yes Dear, to alleviate the software augmentation. The best course of action is to enter the command C:\apologize, because ultimately you will have to give the apologize command before the system will return to normal. Signed, Tech Support. Here's our text today. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Do you know there's a word that doesn't appear there that you'd kind of expect to appear there? And that's the word love. This passage describes the love of a husband, but it doesn't use the word love at all. Most of you know, I have a day job. And in my day job, I am a family law judge, which means I deal with dysfunctional relationships every day. We deal with parents and children and child support and spousal support. We deal with divorce. We deal with all kinds of stuff that relates to dysfunctional relationships. I periodically will, when somebody asks me, about my work, I'll say, well, as long as people misbehave, I've got a job. And that's the truth. And it really doesn't matter whether it's criminal law or family law or whatever it might be. As long as people misbehave, I've got a job. The reality, folks, is we're all incompatible. Every one of us is incompatible with every other of us. Husbands, you're incompatible with your wives. Wives, you're incompatible with your husbands. We all know children think that they're incompatible with their parents. And the reason we're all incompatible with each other is simple. Because we all have one thing in common, and that is we're all sinners. We all have our failings. We all have our faults. Every one of us does. And you can either tear up the picture of the perfect partner that you have in your mind, or you can accept the actual partner you have and accept the picture that presents. So you can tear up the picture of the partner, or tear up the partner and accept the picture. One or the other. In every marriage more than a week old, there are grounds for divorce. The trick is to find and continue to find grounds for marriage. You know, when I was growing up back in Texas, the grounds for divorce were a little bit more complicated than we have today in California, and that they have in nearly every other state in the union. Back then, you had to actually show somebody did something wrong in order to get a divorce. These days, we have this thing, some states call it incompatibility. We call it irreconcilable differences. And what that means is, for some reason or another, one party in the relationship has said, I'm just not willing to accept the other party as they are. They'd rather tear up the relationship than accept the partner with their foibles. Because let me tell you guys, you got yours too. Last week we looked at 1 Peter 3 verses 1 to 6, and we saw how God uses a wife's inner beauty to transform her husband. And we started with the story of last Sunday, actually, Purim, which was a Jewish holiday, is a Jewish holiday, that's based in the book of Esther, where a woman stepped outside of social bounds of convention and went to her husband when she took her life into her own hands to try to get him to intervene on behalf of an entire nation of people. Now, when Esther went to talk to King Xerxes, he's the most powerful man in the world. When she went to talk to King Xerxes, there was a history there that would naturally make her very leery of taking that action. Because you see, he'd had a predecessor queen. Do you remember her name? Vashti. And one time, Xerxes was having a big old party, and he ordered Vashti to show up so he could show everybody how pretty his wife was. She said, nothing doing. He divorced her right there on the spot. She was lucky he didn't kill her. That was the background. When Esther comes into his presence uninvited, she has a history of another woman who's done the very same thing to him. She breached social convention, just like Esther was about to breach social convention. But there was something about the quality of this woman that made him care what she thought. And we talked last week in 1 Peter 3 verses 1 to 6 about how God uses that inner beauty of a woman to transform even a godless man like Xerxes. First Peter 3 verse 7 starts out by telling us that submission is mutual. Wait a minute. The word submit's not found in 1 Peter 3 verse 7 either. The word love's not found there. The word submit's not found there. As a matter of fact, do you remember the whole background of this? Peter's been saying to these readers in the first century, what I want you to do is I want you to live the kind of life that makes your faithfulness attractive even to ungodly people. He said it in verse 12 of chapter 2. Live such good lives that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. I want you to live the kind of lives that make you so attractive that even those outside of Christ will be drawn to want to be like you. He's used some examples. He talked about citizens within society. He's talked about slaves and masters. He's talked about wives. Now he talks about husbands. And he says, husbands, in the same way. Now he doesn't say be submissive to your wife, but that word homoios, in the same way, ties it right back to that theme of submission that he's been preaching ever since 1 Peter 2, verse 12. As citizens within society have to recognize their place. As slaves with masters have to recognize their place. As wives with husbands have to recognize their place, husbands also with wives have to recognize their place. And in a way, that word, in like manner, picks up this idea of submission and carries it not only to the wife, but also now to the husband. Now, every man's favorite verse is Ephesians 5:22. Wives, be in submission to your husbands as to the Lord. Now, when I was growing up, my dad had two favorite verses. That was one of them. And the second one comes from Ephesians 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Those were his two life verses, okay? And those of us who are guys, we can appreciate that. We can understand that. Maybe the ladies don't understand or appreciate that so much. But let me tell you something. This is not where the context starts. Ephesians 5:22 is not where the context starts. As a matter of fact, the context starts one verse earlier in Ephesians 5:21, where Paul writes, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another. We don't like to start there. But after Paul says this, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, he gives 4 examples, like Peter does. He talks about the example for a wife, example for a husband, example for children, example for parents, example for slaves. He talks about examples for masters. Now, newsflash, a lot of husbands don't know this because they're so stuck on Ephesians 5:22. The word submit, where it says, wives, be in submission to your husbands as to the Lord, that word be in submission is not found in verse 22 in this part of the text. It's carried over from verse 21. Verse 21 uses the word submit. And then Paul says literally, wives to your own husbands. What? To your own husbands. What does that mean? The translators go back to verse 21. They pick up the word submit and they put it there because that's what it means. Wives, submit to your husbands. But if you didn't have verse 21, you wouldn't have the word submit in verse 22. It's not in the Greek text in verse 22. Now, it is in the second part, as you submit to the Lord, but not in the first part. You draw it out of verse 21. So verse 21 begins the context, and that's important. Now, I know some of you guys are thinking, now wait a minute, are you telling me that as a husband, I have to submit to my wife? Yeah, you're beginning to get it. Now, Paul doesn't use the word submit when he talks about husbands, but in verse 25 he says this, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. When Jesus died on the cross, what he did was not only submit his will to the will of the Father, he submitted his will to the best interest of the people he was dying for. Christ submitted to you and me. Do you remember that at the Last Supper when Jesus takes that basin of water and that towel and he goes around from one to another washing the feet of the disciples? And then when Peter balks, he says, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have anything to do with me? And Peter says, well, give me a bath. No. I just need to wash your feet. He's doing the work of a servant. He is submitting to those ultimately that he's the Lord of. He's giving an example. Paul comes along and says, husbands, you're to love your wives just like that, just like Christ loved the church. So even though the word submit is not there, the whole concept of submission is. Now, does that mean that the husband stops being the leader in the home? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think ultimately, anytime you've got two people who may have different opinions about something, somebody's got to make the final decision. Even if it's wrong, somebody's got to make the final decision. And guys, let's be honest, sometimes we make the wrong decision. Abraham. Last week we looked at 1 Peter 3 verses 1 to 6. And we talked about how Sarah deferred to Abraham. And there were times when Abraham made the wrong decision. Let's just tell Pharaoh you're my sister. Wrong decision. And not only did he do it once, he did it twice. But then there were times when Sarah made the wrong suggestion and Abraham went along with it too. It looks like we're not going to have a baby, honey, so why don't you have a baby with my servant, Hagar? And that began the trouble that still exists in the Middle East. So sometimes, neither of us has a monopoly on making wrong decisions. We do make wrong decisions. There's an actress, I don't know what I've seen her in. I think like something Greek wedding or some big fat Greek wedding or something like that, Nia Vardalos. She says this: the man may be the head of the household, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn the head whichever way she pleases. Okay? You can have some fun with that. What about this business of mutual submission? I found an illustration I thought was pretty helpful. If you've ever gone driving on a country road, you may have come across a one-lane bridge. Have you ever seen a one-lane bridge? And as you approach that bridge, you'll see a sign that says yield. And you look and see nobody's coming, so you drive across that bridge, right? And then later in the day, you're driving back across that bridge and you get to the bridge and what do you see again? A sign that says yield. And what do? You look before you drive across. And you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I thought the other side was supposed to yield. But isn't the reality both sides yield? Isn't that the truth? Husbands and wives, we need to learn to yield to each other. And from the husband's perspective, that means, guys, stop trying to be the boss all the time. William Hendrickson, a commentator, writes this: when grace changes the heart, submission out of fear changes to submission out of love. So the first point Peter makes is, husband, serve your wife. Put her interests above your own. Put her needs above your own. Like Paul says, love her like Christ loved the church. In the same way that we expect citizens to submit to the society, in the same way we expect slaves to submit to masters, in the same way we expect wives to submit to husbands. Husbands, you need to treat your wives in that same kind of way. Now, the second thing he says is consideration is essential. Look at this. Be considerate as you live with your wives. Think about what God's purpose for your marriage is. It's not a boss and a servant. It's a partnership. So, guys, we need to understand God's purpose for our roles in the marriage is to understand, to appreciate, and show consideration for our wives. I came across this. We ought to be engaged in the lifetime study of our wives, learning what makes them work. If you're going to love her, you need to know her. And think about this. When God created man, the thing he said about man, out of all of the creation, was it's not good for man to be alone. And so he says, I will make a helper suitable for him. Now, that word suitable in Hebrew is really a kind of interesting word. It means like opposite. Like-opposite. It's not a person who is alike, but it's a person who is both like and opposite. In some respects, women are like men. We belong to the same species. Most of our translations use the word suitable or counterpart. But if you think about it this way, it's kind of like a magnet. A magnet has two poles, right? North pole, south pole, right? It's like a battery. It has two poles, positive and negative. And you have to have both in order to make a whole battery or a whole magnet. It's kind of like that Chinese symbol, yin and yang, which is a male-female image that Chinese use. Now, men and women are alike. We're both members of the human race, but we're also different because our brains work differently. Not better, not worse, not inferior, not superior, just different. Men and women do differ in a lot of ways. Our metabolism works differently, our skeletal makeup is different, our blood composition, heart rate, sometimes different. In a conversation, a woman will maintain direct eye contact for an average of 12 seconds. A man will maintain direct eye contact for an average of 3 seconds. Women tend to find their identity in relationships. Men tend to find their identity in their work. What they do expresses who they are. There are a lot of differences between men and women. Harvard University did a study of children on a playground, and what they did is they recorded the noises kids made on the playgrounds. And here's what they found out. The sounds that came out of little girls' mouths were actually recognizable words. But 60% of the sounds that came out of little boys' mouths were sound effects. Vroom, buzz, bam. That kind of stuff, okay? The average woman speaks 25,000 words a day. The average man speaks around 12,500 words a day. About half. Guys, don't opine as to why that is. What does that mean in terms of the marital relationship? When guys get home, they've used 12,495 of their words. They got 5 left. And the wife is just getting started. And he's wondering, how come she talks so much? And she's wondering, why won't he say anything? Somebody asked Elsa Einstein one time, do you understand the theory of relativity? And she says, no, but I understand Dr. Einstein. I wonder if Dr. Einstein understood Elsa as well as she understood him. So Peter says, husbands, you need to live with your wives in an understanding way. The third thing he says is cooperation is practical. Now here's where we get to the point that just rankles women. I'm curious what you think about when you read these words. And treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gift of life. How many of you women find that expression weaker partner to be just kind of annoying? It's what I thought. That's what we'll talk about that in a second. The key word here is respect. The word is timao, which is honor. Show honor to her. Put her on a pedestal. Elevate her. Treat her as something valuable and priceless and precious. We need to treat our wives with respect, with kindness, with courtesy, with chivalry. Okay, guys, I know. I've quit preaching. I've gone to meddling. I'm stomping on my own toes. I know that. But Gary Smalley says this: after interviewing hundreds of wives and daughters, there's one consistent plea that is commonly asked by them of all their fathers and their husbands. Please be comforting instead of lecturing and criticizing. How many times, guys, has your wife started to tell you about something that's going on and your first reaction is to try to fix it? We're fixers, right? They don't want us to fix it. They want us to listen. They want us to be sympathetic. See how women and men are different? What about that weaker partner business? Be thankful that the New International Version uses the expression weaker partner and not the actual Greek words, Because the Greek word for weaker, asthenes, means this. Here are the various translations: strengthless, feeble, impotent, sick, without strength. Ooh, I don't like that. The word partner literally is vessel. Other translations: an implement, equipment, or apparatus. Stuff. I don't blame you ladies for being rankled about that particular word. What do you suppose it is that Peter has in mind? Now, I think, generally speaking, just in physiological terms, we could say, okay, generally speaking, women don't have as much physical strength as men. I don't think that's what Peter's getting at here. I certainly don't think he's talking about mental acuity or mental ability, because I know women who are much smarter than the guys that they're involved with, and I wonder how they ever got hooked up. Right? What is Peter talking about? We live, unfortunately, in a day in our society when we love to judge people in the past by present mores. Have you noticed recently how many times people are wanting to take the name of somebody off of something, off of a school, off of a building, because that person advocated practices that were acceptable in that person's day but are unacceptable to us? Have you noticed that recently? You know, we just want to take their names off. I mentioned last week about Serenus Hastings, first Chief Justice of California. Read up on him. You know, I understand why people are upset with having his name on Hastings Law School. But he also made contributions to our society. We shouldn't throw people out in history who were living according to their mores because their mores don't conform to our mores. Okay? We shouldn't do that. But if you think about what Peter's saying here and put it into context, it would go something like this. Remember, he says, I want you to live such good lives among the pagans that even though they criticize you, they want to be like you.